Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on advanced macOS guidance and workflows. My name is Katie English and I'm from the Jamf product team. I'm a longtime Jamf expert and a career Mac admin, and I'm here today to talk about Mac workflows that build on the session we had last month, which was titled macOS Basics and Best Practices. So this time around, we'll be talking through more advanced workflows centered around local user management. This is a topic that provokes strong opinions in the Mac admin community, but it gives us a great opportunity to talk through better practices, automation of common tasks, scripting, and using self-service and Jamf Connect to empower end users. But first, let's talk just a little bit about Jamf and how we help organizations succeed with Apple. Jamf is the standard for Apple Enterprise Management, serving over 76,000 customers on 33 million devices, and over 100,000 people have joined Jamf Nation, the largest community of Apple admins in the world. Jamf's Apple Enterprise Management solutions are here to help organizations connect, manage, and protect Apple devices. In today's webinar, we'll be diving into many of the challenges the enterprise faces when it comes to securely connecting users to resources, efficiently managing devices and apps, and protecting data, devices, and privacy. We'll discuss solutions to those challenges with a combination of two of our enterprise-focused products, Jamf Pro and Jamf Connect. Another major benefit of choosing Jamf for our exclusive focus on Apple is our history of and commitment to something we call same-day support. Same-day support means less work for you, faster access to new Apple features for your end users, and better control for your admins. For 12 years running, Jamf has delivered support for new Apple operating systems, macOS, iPadOS, iOS and tvOS, even visionOS, the day they're released. If your end users are craving that hot new feature from Apple, it's easy to kick off a mass operating system upgrade across your entire fleet. On the flip side, if you want to pause the availability of a new operating system, you can delay operating system upgrades for up to 90 days so your team can take time to test and validate before making the OS available to everyone. Jamf remains laser-focused on helping you succeed with Apple, and same-day support is one major benefit you'll enjoy for choosing ecosystem management. Now, I mentioned that this session is going to talk through account management workflows, and we're going to start with binding to Active Directory, but I want to explain that I'm using this as an example of a problem that can be solved in multiple ways. Some of you are likely thinking that Active Directory is a legacy workflow that admins shouldn't have to think about anymore, but the questions still come up, especially for those who are newer to Mac management. How do I bind my Mac? Should I even bind my Mac? If you take a look at Jamf Nation or the Mac admins community, you'll see a lot of commentary about whether or not a Mac admin should bind to AD, must bind to AD, or should do everything possible to avoid binding to AD. So briefly, let's talk about the pros and cons. Binding to Active Directory is definitely a legacy workflow, and it definitely assumes your organization is heavily Windows-centric. The benefits of binding are: a user can log into a Mac with their network credentials. You gain the password complexity and expiration rules from AD on the local login, and you can use those network credentials on shared Macs without having to directly manage each individual user who might log in. But the downsides of binding are: if a Mac's not connected to your local network, it might not be able to reach your domain to permit authentication, which in turn causes a lot of frustration around password changes, and Apple's own development efforts are very much trending away from this legacy workflow. In some organizations, you as an admin might not have a lot of choice. Further, you might have Macs in a shared or lab environment where binding is actually the best overall option to allow end users to log in with their network credentials. So let's say you've reviewed the options and decided that you do need to bind your Macs to Active Directory. We'll go ahead and use this workflow as an example of a problem that can be solved in Jamf Pro a few different ways, including scripting, and we'll also build some automation around it. We'll start with option 1, using the built-in directory bindings object. In Jamf Pro Settings Computer Management, you can create an object that will apply the most common directory options. If you compare it to the options available in macOS's native directory utility app, you will see that it looks pretty familiar. You can, of course, create multiple directory binding objects if, for example, different groups of devices need to be bound to different OUs in your directory structure. And after you create the directory binding object, you can create a policy that will add that object scope to whichever devices you need. You should consider the frequency and the event that triggers this policy, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. Now, the directory binding object is one option. How else could we bind a Mac? You can use a configuration profile, and you'll notice that the UI again looks really similar to the directory utility app. This option would be delivered by MDM versus being delivered by the local Jamf binary checking for available policies. And as an MDM setting, this option means that it's applied very quickly once it's scoped. But that also means you don't have full control over when it occurs. If you're the kind of admin who needs that full control, you can also write a script to bind to AD, which might include some additional logic that checks for local device state before attempting to perform the bind operation. Maybe you want to verify that the domain controller is reachable first, or you want to ensure that the Mac is binding using a particular naming convention, or even using the Mac serial number. Ultimately, the command you'll use is dsconfig.ad to add the device with a number of available options to your domain, and you'll want to use a service account that has privileges to add objects to the organizational unit you're targeting. You can also configure mobile account behavior, which will allow a user to log in even when the computer is not connected to the Active Directory server. And just like the directory binding object, we can run this script by way of a policy. I mentioned before that for my policy, the frequency and trigger are important. You'll notice I have it set to ongoing on the recurring check-in. And the reason why is because this will allow me to build some automation around binding and make this common workflow a bit more resilient. A while back, when I was a Mac admin, I worked on a small team that was in charge of hundreds of Macs in shared labs, and some of those labs were in remote locations 100 miles away. If something went wrong, we needed workflows that could detect a problem and, if at all possible, fix itself. In the case of binding to Active Directory, sometimes we had Macs where the binding would fail for one reason or another, or a domain controller would become temporarily unavailable, logins would fail, and the usual path to resolve that would be to unbind and then rebind the Mac. We still had contact with our Macs by way of the device management provided by Jamf, so we set up a way for our management server to be alerted to common failures and automatically try to repair the binding, so no one had to drive 100 miles to go and type commands in by hand. So we'll use this example to talk about automating your work with Jamf Pro. These workflows can be incredibly powerful, and in most cases they rely on smart group logic. That means first, we have to know when a given Mac has slipped into a failure state. And I'm going to start by adding an extension attribute to our Mac inventory. An extension attribute is just a custom field that you can add. It could be a pop-up menu with a number of options you define, it could be a text field, or it could be populated by a script, which is the example we're using here. If it's a script, it's going to run on the local Mac whenever a Jamf recon command calculates inventory changes and reports them back to the server. The script linked here is from GitHub, and it's an older script, so you'll want to test it before using it in your own organization. You'll notice that when you look at it, it's got an XML header, and it's wrapped in extension attribute tags. That means the format will allow us to copy it into a plain text file, save it as a file with an XML extension, and then upload that XML to Jamf Pro as an extension attribute. Once it's there, you can more clearly see the contents of the script and get a feel for what's going on when it runs. It uses the dsconfig.ad and the dscl binaries to read attributes from the local file system about the current known directory bind status. And if that Mac is successfully bound, it will return the path of the organizational unit it's bound to, wrapped in the result tags at the end. That OU will end up in the Mac inventory as a field called Active Directory OU. When you're getting good results from this extension attribute, you can use it for smart group logic. In this case, we'll create a group for Active Directory OU is not the OU name we expect, meaning if any Mac that should be bound suddenly isn't, it'll join the group at next inventory. That group is the target of the policy I made earlier, which is why it's ongoing. When a Mac falls into that group, the policy will run at next check-in. And the script that runs in this policy, I'll build some logic to check network reachability, and then try forcing an unbind from AD prior to rebind, just in case the computer record itself is the problem. I'll also be sure to include the option to update inventory after the script runs, so that after the device has successfully rebound to AD, it updates the extension attribute value and falls out of the smart group. This is the basic way you build automation for a Mac. When something changes from the state you want, you can detect it with a scripted extension attribute, use that extension attribute as the criteria for a smart group, use that smart group as the scope for a policy to remediate condition, and then update inventory at the end so your server knows everything is back the way it should be. One word of caution when you're building automated remediation actions. It is possible for a device to fall into a loop where it tries to remediate itself over and over and never actually succeeds. You can handle this a few different ways. Maybe your AD bind script has logic to fail gracefully after a certain number of attempts, and then you create a different smart group to track that failure. In my lab admin days, we handled it like this. We set client-side limitations on the rebind policy so that it would only attempt during a local maintenance window on weeknights, and we also set up email notifications on the smart group that was targeted by the rebind policy. That way my team would notice if there were any devices that seemed to be frequently affected so we could investigate those further. So again, binding a Mac to Active Directory isn't an ideal experience, but it does help as an example of making particular choices for Mac management and using them to build some automated remediation when something doesn't go right. As with many Mac workflows, you have options about how to implement them. You can use a built-in feature in Jamf Pro, you can use an MDM setting, or you could script it. In most cases, scripting the action is going to allow you the most control. In the example we used, we scripted AD binding specifically because that permits us to do a network check prior to trying the bind action, and it allows us to ensure the Mac device name meets our requirements. We can also use scripting to add custom attributes to a Mac's inventory record in Jamf Pro. In this case, we used an attribute that will detect and report the OU that a Mac is bound to. We used that inventory attribute to build smart group logic, meaning anytime a Mac returns inventory information that doesn't match the OU we expect, that Mac will join the group. And we scoped that group to a policy that will run our bind script, then submit inventory again to update the extension attribute and automatically fall out of the group. And it's always a good idea to test your automated workflows and add in limitations to make sure they don't run away in a loop when you're not looking. So we've talked about ways to optimize your workflows if you still have to bind AD, but maybe you've decided that AD binding isn't actually going to be helpful for your organization. Maybe you've got a lot of mobile users who are less likely to connect to your organizational network by way of VPN, and therefore password resets have become a huge challenge for your help desk. What are your other options? Earlier we talked about the pros and cons of binding to Active Directory and mentioned that a couple of the main benefits are local password synchronization with network credentials, as well as honoring password expiration. So let's talk a little bit about how Jamf Connect could help you with those problems instead. The Jamf Connect app for macOS allows for a couple main features. You can modify the default login window behavior for macOS with custom branding, and you can use a cloud IDP for authentication, including enforcing multi-factor authentication. With the login window experience, you can link a user's network account with an existing local account. Once you've done that, you can use the Jamf Connect menu bar app to allow an end user to have control over their network and local password synchronization. This means instead of binding to AD, your Mac users can authenticate to their Macs with network credentials, but still have all the benefits of a local user account experience. You're far less reliant on an available connection to an Active Directory controller, and your help desk staff won't be stuck trying to troubleshoot password resets for users who are off the network. And honestly, this is great. You get the native Apple end user experience, you get the synchronization with your directory or IDP for password expiration and complexity. Jamf Connect enables a lot of other use cases as well, including privilege elevation. Let's say your organization limits end users from having local admin rights on their Macs. Of course, that reduces security risk, but can also add quite a bit of burden to you or your help desk teammates to take care of tasks on the Mac that require those elevated privileges. Consider privilege elevation with Jamf Connect. There are a couple ways to make this option available to your end users. You can use the Jamf Connect configuration utility to compose the settings to modify the Jamf Connect menu bar app to allow for temporary privilege elevation, including a default duration, maybe 10 minutes, before the user reverts to standard privileges. But also, if you have Jamf Connect configured on the Mac with the URL command line elevation setting enabled, you can create a policy that determines the currently logged in user, then uses the Jamf Connect binary to elevate that user to admin. And we'll take a look at how that works. First, we'll create a policy that executes a command, which we're going to borrow from the documentation linked in the lower left corner. We'll add this policy to Self-Service Plus. And now an end user with standard privileges can simply click the button to be promoted to an admin user. If we want that user to be automatically demoted back to a standard user sometime later, then we have a bit more work to do, and we have some options. Remember from the Active Directory remediation workflow that we can build smart group logic to detect a state on a Mac, then have that Mac join a smart group. That smart group could be the scope for our policy to automatically demote that promoted user. But that might take too long. You'd need to be checking inventory on that Mac pretty frequently to catch a user who had temporarily elevated privileges. That might open a window of risk you don't want to deal with. Instead, we're going to try a workflow that looks like this. What I'm going to do is write a script that will create a launch daemon on the Mac, then set permissions and bootstrap that launch daemon. Let's take a closer look at the important components here. This launch daemon will use the Jamf binary to invoke a policy associated to the event demote connect user, and it's set to fire 10 minutes after it gets bootstrapped. We'll add it to the policy we created before, where an end user in self-service invokes the command to make themselves an admin. That means as soon as they do, the launch daemon is in place counting down for 10 minutes to run the next policy to demote the user again. And that policy will run the Jamf Connect command to demote the current user back to standard privileges, then boot out the launch daemon we created that was running for 10 minutes, then delete the launch daemon plist for final cleanup. Now, this is not a foolproof workflow. That end user may log out, and the command targeting the logged in user for demotion back to standard privileges might then fail. So it's a really good idea to go ahead and augment this automation with some smart group logic to do any stray cleanup. But you'll get the audit logs of both the promotion and demotion policies to track usage in your environment. Now, admittedly, this workflow is fairly complex. These scripts, they're pretty long. So we are looking forward to making a lot more of these powerful Jamf Connect and other end user features easier to access as we're optimizing Self-Service Plus in the future. You'll definitely want to keep an eye on that tool set. So to recap today, we talked through advanced macOS guidance and workflows and really focused on local user management because that is a hot topic for a lot of admins, and it allows us to work through real-world examples of automation, scripting, and self-service. We talked through the pros and cons of binding to Active Directory, the different ways you can bind, the extra control you get from scripting, and the automation you can build around smart group logic that can help you remediate failures in your environment. And for those of you who would be perfectly happy to never bind another Mac to AD, we talked through workflows with Jamf Connect that will allow you to enhance the end-user login experience with custom branding and multi-factor authentication, and then even allow you to extend temporary admin privileges to your standard end users on demand, with automation to demote those users when your policy threshold is elapsed. As always, a webinar is just the start of your journey as an admin. We hope our topic today sparked a few great ideas and will allow your end users, leaders, and IT teammates insights into the possibilities of using Macs in your organization. We do have some additional resources to share with you. Jamf solutions help organizations of any size successfully manage their growing fleet of Apple devices. With device management, the foundational element to serving end users and securing your environment, inventory management, more inventory than anyone with robust integrations via the Jamf Marketplace and Jamf API, app installers for simplified app lifecycle management and policies for advanced workflows, zero-touch deployment, automated and seamless enrollment experience right out of the box, and BYOD, embracing user choice and just right management to empower users while protecting their privacy, and then finally self-service and self-service plus, the ultimate end-user experience, getting everything an end-user needs just one click away. Of course, we are nothing without our customers, and that is proven with the Jamf Nation community. This online forum is home to over 100,000 Apple IT-focused individuals that learned from each other, discussed best practices, and have access to a wealth of resources and third-party tools. Create a free account today to join in on the discussion. And the Jamf Marketplace provides tools and resources to help make the Jamf platform more useful to our customers. We offer a developer portal with the enablement of the community to build tools and resources to help others. We hope you'll join us in Denver, Colorado this October for the largest gathering of Apple IT admins in the world. Register now for the best deal for JNUC 2025. Thanks so much for listening.